The air in St. George's, Hanover Square, was thick with roses and anticipation. Lady Clara Beaumont stood at the altar, a vision in cream lace, her future seemingly secured by the man beside her. But a wedding vow can be a weapon. In a single, horrifying second, her groom's voice, cold and clear, cut through the sacred silence, not with a promise, but with an accusation. He called her ruined. He called her a liar. As hundreds of eyes turned from admiration to icy contempt, Clara's world shattered. She was shamed, abandoned, and utterly destroyed. And then another voice spoke, a darker, more powerful voice that silenced the whispers and claimed her when she had nothing left. The organist's prelude swelled, vibrating through the ancient stones of St. George's. Lady Clara Beaumont felt the music in her chest, a tremor that matched the nervous fluttering of her own heart. Today, she was to become Lady Vance. "You are perfection, my dear," her mother, Lady Beaumont, whispered, dabbing a lace handkerchief at her own dry eyes. The gesture was for show, the sentiment was a command. Be perfect, be the wife he expects. Save us. Clara hadn't needed the words. She understood her duty. Since her father, Colonel Beaumont, had passed, their genteel poverty had become a threadbare cloak, increasingly difficult to patch. Lord Gerald Vance, with his respectable title, and sprawling, though rumoured to be mortgaged estates, was their salvation. He was handsome enough, with a quick smile and a reputation for charm. Clara did not love him, but she was determined to be a good wife, to find contentment in duty, as her mother had always advised. Her eyes scanned the pews, a sea of aristocratic faces, silks and jewels. She saw her younger sister, Emily, beaming with uncomplicated joy. She saw the society matrons, their faces masks of polite assessment. And then, in the shadowed back pew, she saw him, Arthur St. James, the Duke of Ashbourne. A cold stone of surprise dropped into her stomach. The Duke of Ashbourne was a legend, a shadow. He was fabulously wealthy, immensely powerful, and utterly reclusive. He had inherited the title a decade prior and was rarely seen in London, preferring his fortress-like estate in the north. Clara knew him only as a name her father had mentioned, with a strange mix of reverence and sadness. They had served together years ago at Badajoz. "Ashbourne, he's a man carved from granite," her father had once said, "but he does not forget a debt." What was he doing here? He had not even sent a reply to the invitation. He sat alone, his black-clad form a stark void in the colourful assembly. His gaze was not on the altar, but on Lord Gerald, and his expression was one of absolute, arctic contempt. Clara felt a flicker of unease, a sudden irrational desire to pull her veil tighter. Gerald, beside her, preened, adjusting his waistcoat. He hadn't noticed the Duke. He was focused only on the performance of the day. "Beloved," the bishop began, his voice echoing in the rafters. "We are gathered here in the sight of God." Clara took a breath, pushing the Duke from her mind. This was her wedding day. This was her future. She turned her attention to the man she was about to marry. Gerald caught her eye and offered his practiced, perfect smile. The ceremony proceeded. The hymns were sung, the homily given. Clara's responses were soft but clear. She placed her hand in Gerald's, his skin surprisingly cool. "I require and charge you both," the bishop intoned, looking from Gerald to Clara, "as ye will answer, at the dreadful day of judgment when the secrets of all hearts shall be disclosed, that if either of you know any impediment, why ye may not be lawfully joined together in matrimony, ye do now confess it." A standard, formal pause. Clara's heart beat a steady rhythm. Duty, duty, duty. Gerald's hand tightened on hers. Then, slowly, he released it. He took a single, deliberate step back. The silence that followed was not merely a pause, it was a suffocating void. "My lord?" the bishop asked, his brows drawing together in confusion. Clara turned. Gerald was no longer smiling. His face was a mask of curated sorrow and cold righteousness. "Bishop," Gerald said, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent church. "I am afraid I do know an impediment." A collective gasp swept the pews. Lady Beaumont's hand flew to her throat. "I cannot, in good conscience, join myself to this woman." "Gerald," Clara whispered, her blood turning to ice. "What is this? What joke are you playing?" "This is no joke, madam," he sneered, the Lord Vance vanishing, replaced by a stranger. He reached into his waistcoat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I came to this altar today prepared to do my duty, to cover your family's shame with my name. But last night, this proof was delivered to me. Proof of your deception." He held the letter aloft. "Proof that you are not the innocent you pretend to be. Proof that you have been compromised." The word hung in the sacred air, heavy and poisonous. Compromised. It was a death sentence. In that single moment, Clara Beaumont ceased to be a bride. She became a pariah. "Gerald, this is madness," Clara pleaded, her voice a desperate tremor. She reached for his arm, but he recounted as if from a serpent. "Do not touch me," he roared, and the artifice of the sorrowful groom shattered, revealing the raw malice beneath. "Do you deny it? Do you deny that you met with Captain Finn in the gardens of your own home not 2 weeks past?" Clara's mind reeled. Captain Finn? A cousin of a neighbour, a brash young officer who had visited once with his aunt. They had spoken for perhaps 5 minutes, in full view of the terrace. "He was asking after Emily's health. My mother was present." "A convenient story," Gerald scoffed, appealing to the crowd who were now on their feet, murmuring in horrified delight. "This letter from an informant details your trysts. It details how you lured him, how you gave yourself to him, hoping to secure a proposal before I secured mine." "That is a lie," Clara cried, tears of pure, unadulterated shock stinging her eyes. "A vile, wicked lie." "Is it?" Gerald's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper that seemed to echo louder than his shouts. "Then how do you explain your condition? How do you explain that you come to my wedding bed already carrying another man's consequence?" That was it. The final, fatal blow. The accusation of pregnancy. A woman in the front pew, Lady Danbury, let out a scandalized shriek. Clara's mother, Lady Beaumont, made a choked sound and collapsed in a heap of grey silk, Emily's cries lost as she tried to revive her. The church had dissolved into a baying mob. "I am not!" Clara's voice was a raw scream. "I am not! Gerald, in God's name, why are you doing this?" "I am doing this," he said, drawing himself up, "to protect the honor of my name. A name you were clearly desperate to soil. I will not be made a fool, Lady Clara. I will not raise another man's bastard." He threw the letter onto the altar steps. "I leave you to God. I, for one, am done with you." He turned, his boots clicking on the marble, a man striding to his freedom, leaving a woman's reputation in ruins behind him. He had not just jilted her. He had executed her. Clara stood alone, the scent of roses now cloying, suffocating. The whispers were a physical force, pressing in on her. Ruined, with child, scandalous. Poor Gerald, so deceived. She was trapped. There was no defense against such a claim. To deny it was to seem desperate. To be silent was to admit guilt. In the seconds it took Gerald to walk from the altar to the aisle, her entire life, her past, her present, her future, was erased. She was no longer Lady Clara. She was a fallen woman. She swayed, the weight of the veil, the dress, the stairs, threatening to pull her to the ground. She saw the bishop's face, a mask of pity and condemnation. She saw her sister, weeping over their mother's prone form. This was the end. She would be forced into a convent or shipped to some remote, dismal cottage in Wales, living out her days as a spinster, a living ghost, a cautionary tale. Gerald reached the end of the aisle. He paused at the door, as if to survey his handiwork one last time. He looked satisfied. Clara closed her eyes, bracing for the final, crushing wave of humiliation. The long, silent walk of shame, back down the aisle, past the faces of everyone she had ever known. "You will remain, Lord Vance." The voice was not loud, but it was not a request. It was a command wrapped in iron. It cut through the hysterical din of the crowd, silencing every whisper, every sob. Gerald Vance froze, his hand on the great oak door. Slowly, he turned. Slowly, every head in the church turned with him. The Duke of Ashbourne had risen from the back pew. He was stepping into the aisle, his face a mask of cold, aristocratic fury. He moved with a predator's grace, unhurried, inevitable. "I said," the Duke repeated, his voice dangerously soft, "you will remain." The Duke of Ashbourne walked the length of the aisle. The Tun parted for him like the Red Sea, people shrinking back from the aura of sheer, unadulterated power he exuded. He did not look at the gasping crowd. He did not look at the crumpled bride. His eyes, the colour of a winter sky, were fixed solely on Lord Gerald Vance. "Your Grace," Gerald stammered, his confident bluster evaporating. The Duke of Ashbourne was not a fop from Mayfair. He was a power in the land, a man who could destroy fortunes with a single word to the Bank of England, a man who had allegedly killed another in a duel over a forgotten slight. "This is a private matter." "You made it a public matter, Lord Vance," Arthur said, his voice quiet, yet it carried to the rafters. "You stood in God's house and bore false witness. A curious choice." "False! I have proof," Gerald sputtered, gesturing to the letter on the floor. "You have a piece of paper," the Duke corrected, "a prop for your dismal performance. I, however, have facts." He stopped, standing now between Gerald and the altar, a human bulwark. He finally turned just his head to look at the bishop. "My apologies for this interruption, Bishop. It seems a rat found its way into your church." He turned back to Gerald. "You claim the lady is compromised by Captain Finn." "It is true." "It is not," the Duke stated. "It was not a debate, it was a conclusion. Because Captain Finn is, at this precise moment, on a ship bound for India, under orders from his regiment. Orders I took the liberty of expediting 2 days ago, long before your informant's letter." A new silence fell, a silence of confusion. "But the trysts," Gerald began. "You mean the 5-minute conversation on the terrace, overheard by Lady Beaumont and her daughter, Emily?" the Duke continued, his voice relentless. "And as for the lady's condition," he raked Gerald with a look of such profound disgust that Gerald physically recoiled. "You accuse her of that to cover your own. You are a man drowning in debt, Lord Vance. Your estates are mortgaged to the hilt." "Lies! Slander! Are they?" The Duke smiled, a chilling, mirthless expression. "I spent yesterday morning with my bankers. They were most informative about the state of your credit. You required a fast influx of cash. You found one, did you not? Miss Annabelle Dupont, the shipping heiress. She and her father arrived from Boston last month, entirely unaware of our social customs. Gerald's face went from pale to ashen. You couldn't simply jilt Lady Clara. Her family, while not wealthy, has honour. Her late father was a hero. No, the Duke mused. You had to destroy her to escape the contract, to free yourself to pursue the heiress. You needed a reason so foul that society would pity you, and so you concocted this masterpiece of cruelty. Arthur St. James took one more step, and for the first time, Gerald looked genuinely terrified. You are a liar, a coward, and a cheat. You haven't saved your name. You have obliterated it. The crowd was frozen, watching the systematic, brutal dissection of a man's life. "He lies!" Gerald shrieked, looking around for support. But there was none. The eyes that had been on Clara with contempt were now on him with revulsion. He had been unmasked. "Get out," the Duke said softly. Get out of my sight." Gerald Vance, the man who had entered the church a respected groom, scrambled for the door like the rat the Duke had named him, pushing it open and fleeing into the street, pursued by the unified scorn of the ton. The door slammed shut. The silence that returned was absolute. Clara was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. Her mother was stirring, Emily fanning her. The Duke had saved her. He had cleared her name. But it didn't matter. The accusation, even proven false, had been spoken. The mud had been thrown. It would stick. She was still tainted. She was still the bride who had been publicly accused of unchastity at the altar. No one would marry her now. Her family was still ruined, perhaps even more so. The Duke of Ashbourne stood for a moment, his back to her. Then he turned. He walked up the steps and paused, looking down at the letter Gerald had thrown. He bent, picked it up, and tore it in half, then quarters, letting the pieces fall. Then he looked at Clara. His face was unreadable. The anger was gone, replaced by something she couldn't name. He was a stranger, this granite man. "Your Grace," Clara whispered, her throat raw. "I have no words. You have saved my honour." "No, Lady Clara," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I have merely avenged it. The world is not so kind. The whispers will follow you." He was right. She knew it. The reprieve was only temporary. The Duke looked at the bishop, who was wiping his brow. He looked at the gaping crowd. He looked back at Clara, who still stood, a tragic statue, in her wedding finery. "The world is cruel," the Duke said, more to himself than to her. "It requires a starker answer, a permanent one." He took a breath, and then this reclusive, unknowable man did the most impossible thing of all. He knelt. Not a full genuflection, but he went down on one knee on the marble step before her, a move of such profound, unexpected chivalry that Clara gasped. He did not take her hand. He simply looked up at her, his winter eyes searching her face. "Lady Clara Beaumont," he said, his voice clear and resonant, carrying to every ear in the church. "Your father, Colonel Beaumont, saved my life at Badajoz. He pulled me from beneath a fallen cannon, under heavy fire. I told him then that I was in his debt, a debt I could never repay." He paused. "I was wrong. I can repay it. Today." He rose to his full, intimidating height. "This wedding is not over. The groom has merely been replaced." Clara's heart stopped. "What do you mean?" "I mean, Lady Clara, that Lord Vance has proven himself unworthy of your hand. The honour of your father's daughter is not a toy for a scoundrel." He turned, his gaze sweeping over the astonished crowd. "Lady Clara is not fit to marry a liar like Vance, because she is fit to be a duchess." He turned back to her, his expression a mask of pure, unyielding will. "You are in need of a husband. I am, it seems, in need of a wife. Since your groom has proven inadequate, will you accept my hand instead?" The church was so quiet one could hear the gasp of Lady Beaumont as she finally, fully came to her senses. Emily's jaw was on the floor. The bishop looked as if he might faint. Clara stared at the Duke. He was not offering her a courtship. He was not offering romance. He was offering a transaction, a solution. He was offering her his name, his power, his title, like a shield. He was offering her survival. She thought of her mother. She thought of Emily, whose own societal debut would have been impossible, tainted by her sister's scandal. She thought of the life of shame that awaited her. And then she looked at this man, this hard, cold, terrifyingly honorable man. He was offering to bind himself to her, to the center of the greatest scandal of the season, all to repay a battlefield debt to a dead man. "Your Grace," she whispered. "I require an answer, Lady Clara," he said, not unkindly. "The gossips are already composing their stories. We must give them a new ending." She took a shaky breath. She looked past him, at the tattered remains of her family's hopes. She looked at the bishop. "Yes," she said, her voice small but firm. The Duke nodded, once as if a business deal had been concluded. "Yes," Clara said again, louder, lifting her chin. "I will." "Bishop," the Duke said, turning, "we have a wedding to conclude. My special license is at my solicitor's. For now, your blessing on this union will suffice until the full rites can be performed." The bishop, numb with shock, could only nod. The next 10 minutes were a blur. Clara felt like a ghost, a spectator at her own life. The Duke moved to her side, his presence a wall of heat and strength. He did not touch her. Not yet. The bishop, stammering, reread the vows. When the time came, the Duke's voice was firm. "I, Arthur." Clara's was a whisper. "I, Clara." When it was time for the ring, Gerald had, of course, fled with it. The Duke didn't hesitate. He stripped off his own heavy signet ring, the one bearing the Ashbourne crest. "It will have to do," he murmured. It was impossibly large. He didn't try to put it on her finger. He simply pressed it into her trembling, gloved hand. "A pledge," he said. "I now pronounce you man and wife." The Duke of Ashbourne finally took her arm, tucking her hand into the crook of his elbow. It was not a gesture of affection. It was one of ownership. He turned, and for the first time, Clara faced the crowd with him. No one whispered. No one sneered. They were staring, of course, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and awe. They had come to see a wedding. They had witnessed a public execution, a resurrection, and a coup d'etat. The Duke led his new, 20-minute-old wife down the aisle. He did not hurry. His steps were measured, dominant. Clara, her veil still hiding her tear-streaked, shocked face, could only move with him. He led her out of the church, into the bright, uncaring sunlight of London. His ducal carriage, a formidable black and gold affair, was waiting. The footman, seeing his master emerge with a bride in a full wedding gown, did not so much as blink. He simply opened the door. The Duke handed her in. He followed, and the door shut with a heavy, final thud. The carriage lurched forward. They were alone. They sat in silence. Clara was on one side, the Duke on the other. The space between them felt vast, a chasm of unspoken words. She was the Duchess of Ashbourne. The thought was so absurd, she nearly laughed. She was still clutching his ring. It was heavy and warm from his skin. "Where are we going?" she finally asked, her voice small. "To Ashbourne House, my London residence, in Mayfair." His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. He was looking out the window, his profile as severe as a Roman coin. "Your Grace." "Arthur," he interrupted. You will call me Arthur. Your grace is for servants and strangers. She wasn't sure which one she was. Arthur, then. She twisted the signet ring in her lap. I do not understand. Why this? You exposed Gerald. You cleared my name. That was more than enough. The debt to my father was paid. He finally turned his head. His gaze was intense, analytical. Was it? The Ton is a pack of wolves, Lady Clara. They would have torn you apart the moment my back was turned. They would have whispered that my facts were a convenience, that you were indeed ruined, and I had merely covered for you out of respect for your father. In a week, you would be the liar, and Vance the victim. This, he tapped the window, indicating the carriage, the ring, the implicit marriage. This is final. No one questions the Duchess of Ashbourne. He was right. He had not just saved her. He had made her untouchable. So, this is a prison sentence for you, she whispered, horrified. You have shackled yourself to me, to a woman you do not know, to silence gossip. I do not take prisoners, Duchess, he said coolly, and I do not do things I do not wish to do. I am 38 years old. It was time I produced an heir. My solicitors have been nagging me about it for years. You are of good blood, good breeding. You are the daughter of a man I respected. You will do. Clara recoiled. I will do. He spoke of her as one might speak of a brood mare. The coldness of it was a slap, more shocking than Gerald's betrayal. Gerald's was fire and malice. This was ice and pragmatism. I see, she said, her voice equally cold. A transaction. Precisely, he said. You are saved from ruin. Your family's future is secure. I, in turn, gain a wife and, eventually, an heir, thus fulfilling my ducal responsibilities. It is a logical arrangement. The carriage rattled over the cobblestones. Clara looked out the window, her heart a leaden weight. She had escaped one monster, only to be claimed by another. A far more powerful, far more controlled, and far more dangerous one. And love? She dared to whisper, the word tasting like ash. The Duke was silent for a full minute. Love, madam, he said finally, is a luxury afforded to dairymaids and poets. It has no place in our world. What I offer is better. I offer you my protection. I will never lie to you. I will never betray you. And I will never, ever let anyone harm you. In return, you will be my Duchess. The carriage stopped. They had arrived at Ashbourne House. A footman opened the door. Arthur, Duke of Ashbourne, turned to her, his face unreadable. He held out his hand. Welcome home, Duchess. Ashbourne House was not a home. It was a statement. A vast, imposing edifice of Portland stone in Mayfair. It felt more like a museum than a residence. The floors were Italian marble, the ceilings were painted with gods and heroes, and the silence was absolute. The staff lined the entryway, a formidable row of men and women in pristine black. They were led by Mrs. Thorne, the housekeeper, a woman who looked as unyielding as the granite Duke himself. Your Grace, Mrs. Thorne said, bowing, her gaze flickering to Clara for a single, assessing second. Mrs. Thorne, Arthur said, stripping off his gloves. This is the Duchess of Ashbourne, my wife. She will require everything. See to it. Of course, Your Grace. And with that, he was gone. He turned on his heel and strode down a long corridor, disappearing into a room that Clara would come to know as his study. The heavy oak door shut with a final, echoing boom. Clara was left standing in the cavernous hall, still in her wedding dress, her veil askew, clutching a duke's signet ring. If you'll follow me, Your Grace, Mrs. Thorne said, her voice betraying no surprise. Clara was led up a sweeping staircase to what would be her chambers. It was not a room. It was a suite, larger than her entire family's London flat. It was decorated in shades of pale blue and silver, beautiful, opulent, and utterly freezing. "The Duke's chambers are in the West Wing, Your Grace," Mrs. Thorne stated flatly. "Yours are here, in the East. It is how the late Duke and Duchess preferred it." "Separate wings, of course." The next few weeks passed in a surreal, silent fog. Clara, now dressed in the finest silks, a dressmaker had been summoned, her bills paid by an unseen hand, lived the life of a pampered prisoner. She was, as Arthur had promised, untouchable. When she drove in the park in the ducal carriage, the ton bowed and scraped. The same women who had looked at her with contempt in the church now simpered and curtsied, desperate for an invitation to Ashbourne House. Her mother and Emily were installed in a smart new townhouse, their debts paid. Emily was to be presented next season, sponsored by the Duchess of Ashbourne herself. Clara had saved them. She had saved everyone but herself. Her husband was a ghost. They met precisely at 8 o'clock every evening for dinner in a dining room that could seat 50. They sat at opposite ends of a vast mahogany table, separated by a forest of silver and crystal. Their conversation was stilted, polite, and brief. "Was your day agreeable, Duchess?" "Yes, thank you, Your Grace. I read in the library." "Arthur?" "Arthur, yes, and yours." "Productive." He was not cruel. He was simply absent, a wall of flawless, cold courtesy. He had given her his name, his ring, his house, and his protection. He had clearly decided that was enough. But Clara was not built for idleness. She was her father's daughter, pragmatic and observant. She began to watch. She saw him with his secretary, his mind sharp as a razor, dispatching business for his vast estates with terrifying efficiency. She saw him with his tenants when she visited a London property he owned. He was stern, but he was fair. He ordered a new roof for one, and a better water pump for all, before the foreman had even finished his report. And she began to notice other things. She found a small, worn volume of poetry, Byron, left in the library, with one passage heavily marked. It was a passionate, despairing verse. It did not seem to fit the man of logical arrangements. One evening, a young footman dropped a priceless porcelain vase. Mrs. Thorne turned white, ready to dismiss the boy on the spot. Before she could speak, Arthur, who had been passing, simply said, "Sweep it up, Mrs. Thorne. It was a clumsy design. Find a replacement. And see that William gets a new pair of boots. Here's a split." Clara, watching from the landing above, felt a strange, unfamiliar warmth. The wall around him was high, but she began to suspect it was not built of ice. It was built of stone, and it was meant to keep something in. The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came a month after their wedding. There was a mandatory ball at Buckingham Palace. They had to attend. Clara, dressed in Ashbourne blue, was nervous. This was their first true public appearance as a couple. The moment they entered, the whispers began. But there was a new face in the crowd. Lady Beatrice, a striking redhead, known for her sharp tongue, had set her sights on the Duke years ago, and had been enraged by his sudden marriage. "Your Grace," Lady Beatrice cooed, sliding up to Arthur, her eyes dismissing Clara entirely. "We thought we'd lost you to the north forever, and then you return with a surprise." She finally looked at Clara. "Such a dramatic wedding, Duchess. I hear it was the talk of the season." It was a direct attack, a reminder of the altar. Clara froze. Before she could find her voice, Arthur's hand was at her back, a firm, warm pressure. "Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice a silken warning. "You are correct. Our wedding was memorable. But then, I find my wife is a woman one does not easily forget." He did not raise his voice. He did not issue a threat. But the message was clear. Lady Beatrice turned pale, curtsied, and fled. He had defended her. Again. Later that night, back at Ashbourne House, Clara found herself unable to sleep. She walked to the West Wing. It was forbidden territory, but she didn't care. She found him not in his bed, but in a small, dark study she hadn't known existed. He was sitting in a chair, a glass of brandy in his hand, staring at a portrait. It was not a portrait of her. It was a portrait of a beautiful, laughing woman with dark, cunning eyes. "Arthur?" Clara said softly. He started, rising to his feet. He looked not cold, not angry, but tired. "You should not be here," he said, but there was no bite in it. "Who is she?" Clara asked, gesturing to the painting. He was silent for a long time. "Her name was Isabella. My intended, some 15 years ago." Clara waited. "She was my light," he said, his voice rough. "I was a fool. I loved her, as you said, like a poet." He took a drink. "She ran off with my closest friend, my cousin, but not before they emptied my London accounts." Clara gasped. "That," Arthur said, turning from the painting, "is what love is, Duchess. It is a weakness. It is a vulnerability to be exploited. It is a compromise." He had used Gerald's word, but he meant something entirely different. Clara finally understood. His coldness wasn't for her, it was for himself. He wasn't a man of ice. He was a man who had been burned so badly he'd sworn off fire forever. He lived in this emotional fortress because he was terrified of being vulnerable, of being the fool again. He had married Clara not just for logic, but because he knew she wouldn't betray him. She was a woman of honor, her father's daughter. It was a safe arrangement. "Arthur," she said, stepping into the room, "what Gerald did that was malice, what Isabella did that was betrayal, it is not love. It is all the same in the end," he said, turning to the window. "No," Clara said, her voice stronger now. "It's not. My father, the debt you owed him. You said he saved your life." "He did. I think," she said, pausing. "You've been repaying him every day since, by not living the life he saved." He stiffened, but he did not turn. She had overstepped. "Good night, Your Grace." She turned to leave. "Clara." She stopped. "The name of my father's estate," he said quietly, still facing the window. "It was called Ashbourne. I took the name for my title when it was granted. My real name, my family name, is St. James." He had given her a piece of himself, a small, tiny crack in the granite. The relative peace of their cold marriage was not to last. Though Gerald Vance had fled London, he had not fled his spite. Ruined, cast out, and now hunted by the creditors Arthur had sicked upon him, he was a desperate man. And a desperate man is dangerous. He found a willing co-conspirator in Lady Beatrice. She had not forgiven Arthur for his public snub, nor Clara for stealing the title she believed was hers. Together they concocted a new, more insidious plot. If they couldn't ruin Clara's reputation with a new scandal, they would prove the old one. Their plan hinged on the man Gerald had named, Captain Finn. Arthur had been correct that Finn was supposed to be on a ship to India. But a stop order from a competing and slightly corrupt military official, paid for by Beatrice's jewellery, had him pulled off the ship at Gravesend. They brought him to London. They offered him a sum of money that, to a disgraced third-son captain, was a king's ransom. All he had to do was tell his story. The setting for their trap was the most public of places, the grand costume ball at Devonshire House, the glittering centrepiece of the late season. "I do not wish to go," Arthur stated, scowling at the invitation. "We must," Clara said. She was surprised at her own conviction. To not go is to hide. It is to give them power. He looked at her, a strange, appraising look. "Very well, Duchess. We will go." Clara chose her costume carefully. She went as Artemis, the huntress, goddess of the moon. It was fitting, she thought. She was tired of being the prey. Arthur, in a moment of dry wit, went as Hades, lord of the underworld, dark, rich, and powerful. The ballroom was a crush, and there, holding court, was Lady Beatrice, dressed as Cleopatra. Beside her, looking nervous and far too pleased with himself, was a man in a bright red officer's uniform. "Oh, Duchess!" Beatrice called out, her voice dripping poison. "Look who has returned from the dead!" The music seemed to quiet. A circle formed. Captain Finn stepped forward, preening. "Your Grace," he said to Clara, bowing low, a mocking glint in his eye. "You are as radiant as you were in the gardens. I have missed you." The implication was clear. It was a public, calculated insult. Clara felt Arthur's hand on her back, his fingers pressing. "Stay calm." "Captain Finn," Clara said, her own voice cool. "I am surprised to see you. I had thought you bound for India. My husband, the Duke, was so looking forward to hearing of your safe passage." Finn faltered. This was not the trembling, ruined girl he'd been told about. "Ah, yes," Finn stammered. A last-minute change of orders. "How fortunate," Arthur's voice rumbled, stepping forward, his Hades costume suddenly seeming all too real. "It allows you to correct the record." "Correct the record?" Lady Beatrice chimed in. "I think he is here to set it straight. He has told me the most interesting story of your acquaintance, Duchess." "Has he?" Arthur smiled. It was the same smile he had given Gerald in the church, the smile that promised utter ruin. "Indeed," Gerald Vance said, stepping out from behind a pillar. He was gaunt, his clothes were still fine, but he wore them with a desperate, haunted air. "Tell them, Finn. Tell them all how she begged you, how she wrote you letters." The crowd gasped. This was theatre of the highest order. Clara stood her ground. "I wrote no letters." "Liar!" Gerald shrieked. "Show them, Finn." Captain Finn reached into his coat. He pulled out a packet of letters, tied with a ribbon. "She wrote me daily, Your Graces," he said to the crowd, "telling me of her love, pleading for me. I am a weak man, I admit. I could not resist her. I am only here tonight to clear my conscience and to beg the Duke's forgiveness for his wife's past." It was brilliant. It was diabolical. They were painting Arthur as the cuckold, the fool. Clara looked at the letters. She knew that handwriting. It was Emily's, her sister's naive, looping script. "That is my sister's hand," Clara whispered, confused. "Aha!" Beatrice cried. "She tries to blame her own sister." Clara's mind raced. Emily Captain Finn the garden. Emily had a brief, foolish infatuation with him. He had paid her compliments. She must have written these letters, not Clara. They had been stolen. But before Clara could even form the words, Arthur laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. It was a cold, harsh bark that silenced everyone. "This is," Arthur said, "the most pathetic, poorly staged farce I have ever witnessed. And I have been to Parliament." He looked at Captain Finn. "You were paid well, I trust? Vance is penniless, so it must have been Lady Beatrice's diamonds. Let us see." He strode forward, and, before Finn could react, snatched the letters from his hand. He didn't read them. He simply held them up. "You expected me to be surprised by this?" he asked the assembly. He looked at Gerald. You are a fool, Vance. You always were. You think I am you? You think I do not investigate my investments?" He turned his cold gaze on Captain Finn. "I knew you were pulled from the ship at Gravesend. I knew the moment Lady Beatrice's banker made a large withdrawal. I knew when you were installed in a cheap lodging house in Chelsea." He then looked at his wife. "And I knew that my sister-in-law, Emily, had a foolish, childish crush on this captain, and wrote him several very silly letters, which my wife confiscated weeks ago. She told me about it herself." He looked back at Finn. "Which means, Captain, that these letters are forgeries, and rather poor ones at that." He held them out. "This is not Lady Clara's hand. It is not even Lady Emily's. It is a clumsy, masculine scrawl. You, sir, are a fraud." Clara stared at him. None of that was true. She hadn't confiscated any letters. She hadn't told him. He was lying. He was lying, brilliantly and fluidly to save her. "And," the Duke continued, "as for the original plot," he snapped his fingers. Two large, unsmiling men, who had been lingering by the door, moved forward. They seized Captain Finn. "What is this?" Finn yelled, panicked. "This," Arthur said, "is my solicitor, and his clerk, and they have a statement, one you signed this afternoon, Captain, in my library, in exchange for a real ticket, first class, to Australia. One that detailed, in excruciating detail, how Lord Vance and Lady Beatrice paid you to come here tonight and lie. How they gave you these forged letters." Arthur smiled at the gasping crowd. "I am a man who believes in thorough preparation. We were merely waiting for the public performance to conclude. It was, as I said, pathetic." Lady Beatrice looked as if she'd been struck. Gerald Vance was already trying to bolt for the door. "Oh, no, you don't," Arthur murmured. He gestured. The solicitor's men, having secured Finn, moved and blocked Gerald's path. "Slander!" Beatrice shrieked. "You cannot prove a thing." "Oh, but I can," a new voice said. A woman stepped out of the crowd, Annabelle DuPont, the American heiress. "Lord Vance," she said, her Boston accent cutting through the English air, "told me everything. He thought I was as big a fool as he was. He bragged about his original jilting plan. And then he bragged about this one, trying to get more money from me to silence the Duke." She looked at Gerald with pure contempt. "My daddy always said, 'Don't invest in a losing venture.' You, sir, are the losingest venture I've ever seen." It was over. Gerald collapsed, sobbing. Lady Beatrice, for the first time in her life, was speechless. She was surrounded by a wall of women turning their backs on her. Her social life was over. Arthur's men escorted the three conspirators from the room. The Duke of Ashbourne turned, the ballroom silent around him. He held out his arm to his wife. "Duchess," he said, as if nothing had happened, "I believe this is our waltz." He led her onto the floor. The orchestra, after a panicked look from the host, struck up a hesitant waltz. They moved as one. Clara had never been in his arms before. He was an excellent dancer, strong and sure. He held her firmly, respectfully, his hand a warm, solid presence on her back. They were the only two on the dance floor. They were, in that moment, the only two people in London. "You lied," Clara whispered, her head bent, her voice lost in the music. "I reframed the narrative," Arthur replied, his voice a low rumble in her ear. "I didn't tell you about Emily's letters." "How did you know?" "I didn't," he said. "I know my wife. I knew you were not foolish enough to write them. But I suspected your sister might be. It was a logical deduction. The rest was theatre." "Captain Finn, you really met with him?" "This afternoon. I offered him 5 times what Beatrice offered, and a choice, A new life in Australia, or a very old, very dark cell in Newgate for fraud and conspiracy to defame a duke. He made a wise decision. He spun her, her skirts flaring. She looked up at him, at this complex, ruthless, brilliant man. "You did all this," she said, breathless. "You orchestrated this entire night." "I protect what is mine, Clara," he said, his voice dropping, losing its aristocratic coldness, becoming something else, something rough and possessive. "I told you I would." The waltz ended. They stood alone in the center of the room. The crowd burst into applause. It was not for the dance. It was for them, for the victory. The Duke and Duchess of Ashbourne were not just a scandal. They were a power. They rode home to Ashbourne House in silence. But this time, it was not the cold, empty silence of their wedding day. It was a silence charged with unspoken, untested emotion. When they arrived, he did not go to the West Wing. He followed her to the east. He dismissed her maid with a look. They were alone in her chambers. "Clara," he said, and his voice was raw. He was no longer the Duke. He was Arthur St. James. Tonight was a necessary ugliness. It is over. They will never trouble you again. "Thank you," she said, sinking onto a chaise lounge, her knees weak. "You have once again saved me." "No," he said, standing before her. "I have not. I have merely postponed a decision." He began to pace, the first time she had ever seen him look uncertain. "When I stepped in at that church," he said, "I told you it was a debt. I told myself that. It was a lie." Clara looked up, her heart hammering. "Oh, the debt was real," he said. "Your father was a good man." "But that was an excuse. I had seen you, in the park, with your sister, at a lecture. I saw goodness, decency, strength, things I had forgotten. And I saw Vance, and I knew what he was. I went to that wedding to stop him, to expose him if I could. I did not plan on the rest." He stopped and looked at her. "I married you for logical reasons, to protect you, to get an heir, to shield myself, to shield yourself from love," she finished softly. "Yes." He ran a hand through his hair. "And I have been a coward. I bound you, a vibrant, warm, living woman, to a mausoleum, to a man made of granite." He knelt before her, just as he had at the altar. But this time, it was not a public act of chivalry. It was a private act of surrender. "Clara, Duchess, I have cleared your name. The world knows you are innocent. Your family is secure. The debt is paid, the true debt, and you are free." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a legal document. "This," he said, "is an annulment, signed by the Archbishop. It cites non-consummation. It is all perfectly legal and discreet. You can take it. You can walk out of this house, and you will be Lady Clara Beaumont again. Wealthy, respected, and for the first time truly free. I will not hold you to a bargain made in terror." He offered her the paper. Clara looked at the document. It was her escape. It was the life she should have had. And she thought of her cold, empty chambers. She thought of his in the West Wing, with the portrait of the woman who had broken him. She thought of this brilliant, broken, fiercely protective man. She thought of what he'd said, "I protect what is mine." She looked at the paper, and then she looked at him. "You are a fool, Arthur St. James," she said softly. He flinched, his eyes filled with a pain that cut her to the quick. "You are a fool," she repeated. "If you think this," she tapped the annulment, "is what I want. You think you are a man of granite? You are not. Granite doesn't bleed. Granite doesn't protect. Granite doesn't lie at a ball to save the honor of a woman he claims to be a logical arrangement. She stood up, forcing him to rise with her. "You claimed me at the altar to save my life," she said, her voice shaking with a new, powerful emotion. "It was the act of a duke. But what if I wish to claim you?" He stared at her, stunned, hope and terror warring in his eyes. "Clara, you offered me protection. You offered me your name. But you never offered me you." She reached up and placed her hand on his chest, over his heart. "I do not want an annulment, Arthur. I do not want to be Lady Clara. I am the Duchess of Ashbourne." She took the signet ring, which she still wore on a chain around her neck, and held it up. "You gave me this as a pledge." Then she took his hand, his large, warm, strong hand. She took the ring off the chain and pressed it back into his palm. "I do not want this pledge," she said. "I want my wedding ring." He searched her eyes, his own shining with a vulnerability she had never seen. "Clara, are you sure?" "I am not an easy man." "You are not," she agreed, "but I am not an easy woman. I am the woman who was shamed at the altar. And you the duke who stepped in?" She smiled, a true, radiant smile. "My name is Clara, and I am your wife." He looked at her for a long, endless second. The granite crumbled. The man emerged. "Clara," he whispered, his voice thick. He dropped the annulment papers to the floor. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and cupped her face. "You are my Duchess." "I am," she whispered back. "You are mine." "And you," she said, rising on her toes to meet him, "are mine." When he kissed her, it was not a transaction. It was a claim, a mutual, fiery, and absolute claiming that sealed the vow that had, until this moment, only been words. The Duke had claimed his Duchess, and in doing so, the Duchess had finally, truly claimed her Duke. From the depths of humiliation, a new life was forged. Lady Clara, shamed and abandoned at the altar, was told her life was over. But true strength isn't about avoiding the fall. It's about who stands with you when you rise. The Duke of Ashbourne stepped in, not just with his name, but with his power, his intellect, and ultimately, his hidden heart. Theirs was not a marriage of convenience. It was a marriage of fire and iron, a fortress built in the middle of a battlefield. They went from strangers to allies, and from allies to an unshakable force. True love isn't always found in a gentle courtship. Sometimes it's found in the moment one person looks at another in their darkest hour and says, "They will not destroy you. Not while I stand." If you loved this story of redemption and unexpected passion, please don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who needs a reminder that even the worst day can lead to the best ending. And be sure to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss another story of love against all odds. Thank you for listening.